All right, sounds good. So again, sorry about all the confusion. So let's talk about what the developer experience is, right? I mean, so it's a fairly easy concept to understand, right? I mean, the experience of the developers while they interact with the tools, frameworks, and the process, across the whole SDLC process. That's essentially what we call as the developer experience. And the part that makes developer experience really difficult is the fact that it's got those people, process, and technology components. Precisely in that order, right? Because when you have some of those people issues and the process and technology issues, it's somewhat easier for us to fix the technology problems, but the people and process becomes far more difficult. So that's the reason why improving the developer experience is as important as it is. Next slide. So as we actually look at this, one of the things that we actually see in the industry is that there is a lot of focus happening on the developer experience today. I'm sure you all look at Gartner and Forrester reports and other analyst reports and all that, just to call out some very important things that are happening within the industry right now, right? You see that about 65% of the executives and organizations are really looking at DevX as being one of their top goals for next year. And out of that, nearly everybody, like 88% of them, believe that platform engineering is the key to solving some of the developer experience problems. So this is really interesting because what that really tells us is that the awareness of platform engineering as the solution to some of the developer experience problems are out there today. And again, the last piece of data that you see on that bottom right is also very important to call out, right? If you look at organizations today, about 45% of the organizations have some kind of a dev portal. I'm sure you are aware of those concepts of developer portals, things like Backstage from Spotify and all that, and a platform engineer, an engineering platform behind the scenes. And I think that is the kind of solution that most organizations are putting together. And right now, it's about 45%. Over the next couple of years, we are expecting that to actually grow to 75%. So you can see the drastic adoption rate that is happening within this phase. Next slide. So let's first look at let's first look at like how do we actually improve the developer experience, right? I mean, I think of it like at a high level. It's as simple as doing everything else. So you start with understanding your input and assessment techniques. Then you identify what the gaps are. Once you identify the gaps, you go in and strategize and plan and then execute. Fairly simple, right? So what are the kind of things that happens in the assessment side of things? We are aware of a lot of the qualitative and quantitative assessments. So it's important that we always think about both qualitative and quantitative. By that, what I mean is most organizations, especially after the Accelerate book came out and the idea of DORA metrics and things like that have been there, most organizations have been just looking at that. So right now, the understanding is that we should be really looking at both that developer sentiment, doing those developer interviews and understanding where the developers stand, and before we actually try and just look at the metrics. So we need both of those things. We need to understand how developers feel in their experience, as well as measure that by instrumenting things within your SDLC. So once you do that, you have both your metrics, right? So you have your like quantitative and qualitative metrics, but also the concept has to be like, are we really finding the right kind of metrics ahead of time before you look at it after implementing your SDLC or putting your software in production. That's why those leading and lagging metrics is important. Things like DORA metrics is typically a lagging metrics because you know about that after the fact. Take something like mean time to recover, right? You don't know that time until you recover. So you have to really think about what are the kind of things that developers typically see, which are mostly leading metrics. This would be things like how much time does it take for me to actually do a code review? How much time does it take for me to do a PR and those kinds of things? So you have to really look at all of those things and identify where the gaps are. Once you know that, you can really start getting into putting the roadmap together and looking at your technical options to build the right kind of capabilities and then eventually go and build some of these solutions. Next slide. So as you go through this, how do you make this actionable, right? I mean, so the first step in the process is, again, something that we are all familiar with, start doing that developer journey. So think about every developer and seeing what are they actually doing and what are the kind of things that they typically do in the process of defining your product to actually getting the product deployed in production. So think about all the aspects around that. Once you do that, connect those metrics that we spoke about in the previous slide and really start assessing that developer's experience. So again, as I would want to call out again, the metrics have to be both leading and lagging. Just using a DORA metrics isn't going to help you. I mean, so this is where more like the space metrics and some of the other leading metrics should come in. Once you do that, you can start doing your qualitative and quantitative assessments. But that last step is extremely important there, right? Think about like, if you're building a capability, a platform capability, everybody is going to ask like, why are you doing it? So you could say that, hey, I'm doing it because that's going to improve the developer's experience. But is that good enough? The answer to that is probably not, right? You have to really tell the people who are actually paying for this work, saying that how much value are they going to get out of it? If your organization's leadership is actually going to go pay for fund your team, fund those capabilities, and fund the time that you have to build some of these things, you have to show them how to actually see the value. So, and we'll talk about a technique that we are using to make sure that you can actually do that. Next slide. So as we start talking about, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, okay, thank you. So as we talked about the platform engineering being the solution to some of the developer experience problems, that is fairly well known. And we also saw some data from Gartner and Forrester earlier that, significant amount of the executives believes that is the way to do it. So that is an accepted practice within the industry. So it's important for us to understand what platform engineering is. I'm sure, being at the DevOpsDays conference, you're all familiar with platform engineering, but let me just take a shot at simplifying and baselining that definition. So the way I look at it is that platform engineering is essentially designing, building, and maintaining that underlying infrastructure where your services are run, right? Where your developers actually develop and how you actually go and deliver the software applications and services. So it's that foundational layer where all those capabilities are built as a product. So that's the idea of platform engineering. Next slide. So one easy way to know how platform engineering sort of ties in with DevOps and DevX and SRE and all that is to look at something like this, right? And again, this is a very simplistic view of it, but this is where we have to really start having some of the conversations, because let's assume a scenario. You're going to your executives, your leadership, and say, hey, I want to build this platform engineering activities to improve the developer experience. Immediately, they would turn around and say that, oh, I have a DevOps team, I have an SRE team, why should I be doing it? So having some clear articulation of what those things are very important. So the way I would look at this is that platform engineering is that foundation that enables DevOps. So DevOps, even though we still have a lot of organizations with DevOps teams and DevOps engineers and all that, DevOps is ultimately a cultural paradigm, right? DevOps is not tools, DevOps is not a team. DevOps is essentially a cultural paradigm that essentially improves that collaboration between different parts of your development organization. So essentially, platform engineering enables that. Platform engineering also supports SRE, right? The site reliability engineering is something that is, we are very well aware of. So this supports that because SREs requires more of the platform capabilities. Similarly, on the DevX side of things, DevX requires platform engineering, as we spoke about. So again, use this as a simple model, if you will, because this makes it easy for you to explain where it all fits in the larger scheme of things. Next slide. So you might also think about like, okay, what's the scope of platform engineering? Because depending on who you talk to in different organizations, people end up coming up with different ways of defining and scoping platform engineering. So let's first talk about like what's the scope of it. So to me, there are about 7 planes within this whole idea of platform engineering. Those 5 horizontal planes that you see there, as well as 2 vertical planes. 5 horizontal planes, if you start from the bottom, the security and networking is fairly self-explanatory. The runtime plane is where we have most of the conversations these days. Whenever we talk about containers or Kubernetes and all that, it's that that plane that actually tells you what are the kind of things that you should be doing for your developers and what are the kind of capabilities that you could be building. The compliance and governance plane is also very important because we are not just talking about your pipelines or your CI/CD, right? It's about like how do you make sure that your CI/CD pipelines are actually doing more of the compliance activities at the point of change. At every step of your continuous delivery, are you actually doing compliance? Are you actually trying to do the right kind of governance to make sure that things are working as expected? And the top one is also fairly explanatory, right? I mean, this is where you're doing your version control, your IAC, and things like that. But what I would also want to point out is those two vertical planes that you see on either side. Observability plane is something that, again, I'm sure all of you are aware of observability, but the idea of observability here is not just an application observability. What we are really talking about is an observability that actually spans across not just application, but application, infrastructure, your cloud services, your incidents, your actual portfolio, your even eventually your business operations, right? If you can't get that complete holistic view of observability, you're almost always going to have challenges with respect to providing the outcome that you want. So that's the other part of it. But the last part, to me, the most important part, which the previous speaker also talked about a little bit, is this platform product management idea, right? So these platform capabilities that we are talking about should be built as products. And we'll talk about what that means. But the idea is that it should have a life cycle. These capabilities should have a life cycle. It should have a very specific set of capabilities like self-serve and composability and those kinds of things, and make sure that this is something that you can really justify investing in as a, in a life cycle. But also think about things like how do you articulate value? How do you actually set up your organization? And again, the previous speaker talked about team topologies. The idea of how do we actually set up the platform organization within your organization, making sure that it is actually doing what it's supposed to do. Next slide. So let's quickly talk about the value prop of platform engineering, right? So if you really look at what platform engineering is going to do for you, the value comes from three different axes, right? The bottom axis that you see there is that organizational axis. How is that really helping your organization move forward? So this is where that community engagement would come in. So community in this case meaning your developer community, right? How do you improve your metrics? How do you actually empower your teams to do what they need to do as opposed to having a set of people sitting on the side and doing it for you? The other one is the system value, right? I mean, essentially, like overall, in across your system, are you creating a system with composable architecture? Are you getting completely locked into a particular vendor, for example, which is a terrible thing, right? So if you can create that kind of a composable architecture, it becomes far more easier for you to achieve your goals. Similarly, on the developer value side of things, you can see that platform engineering sort of encourages experimentation. You can do quick turnaround of things, essentially reduces that cognitive load so that your developers don't have to learn newer things all the time, and ultimately provide that paved road, right, the guardrail, so that you're not really giving developers like 100 different options to choose from and everybody going in different directions. Instead, you're really giving them the paved path, saying that here's the standardized way of doing it. Within the standardized way of doing it, you're providing them all the flexibility that they need. Right, next slide. So, so how is platform engineering helping DevEx, right? I mean, so this is, again, we should not need any more justification at this point, but if you really look at the state of platform engineering report that just came out a couple of months back, from puppet.com, you can see that, when you ask the engineers who are working on it, the executives who are working on it, they are clearly saying that ultimately platform engineering is to help developer experience. You can see that the first option that they picked is increased productivity, right? Productivity of developers. But if you go down that list, you can see that pretty much all of those things are developer experience related, right? Better quality of software, reduced errors, so essentially having reduced cognitive load. Pretty much everything sort of relates back to this idea of having, a better developer experience. Next slide. So before we actually jump into the actual techniques that we want to talk about, let's quickly talk about this value modeling concept, because this is important as you really look at some of these advanced techniques, because everything requires some investment. If you're building a capability, it requires some investment. But how do you actually do that? How do you justify those things? So the value modeling is a concept that actually provides you an easy framework for you to look at what you're doing and understand what the value is. If you want to scan that QR code, you can actually download a paper that actually talks about this in detail, what I'm going to talk about here in detail. But the idea here is that you first need to figure out who your pilot users are. You can't really be building all your capabilities for everybody day one. So you need to first identify that. And this is where your technical product management teams could be useful. But then after that, make sure that you're not going and building something that you can buy, because It might look like buying a license for a particular tool is probably more expensive. It might be just easier for you to go do something on the side. But remember that your total cost of ownership over the life cycle of that product is always going to be challenging. So you might want to try and see that go out and buy things that you can buy and look at the TC at that level. Then demonstrating quick value or creating that minimum viable product or minimum viable platform in this case is extremely important. It is not okay for us to actually say, hey, I got these capabilities, I'm going to go build it, and I'll come back in 2 months or 3 months. No, let's think about it like an iterative way of doing it, an agile way of doing it, so that you can demonstrate that MVP value quickly. The last point to think about here is that do not scale a platform if you don't have to, right? If your organization is supporting 20 developers, there is really no reason for your platform to be supporting 1,000 developers today, right? You should really be scaling up your platform when your development team also grows, when your user base also grows. Next slide. So now let's talk about these modern techniques, right? So all the things that we spoke about, those 6, 7 different planes within the platform engineering, how it actually helps developer experience, those things are all table stakes at this point, right? We no longer talk about a scenario where we have, those things are really making a huge difference because everybody's expected to do it. I know that there's some organizations who may not be doing it, but you know that this is something that is expected. But now, as we really look ahead, what we really have to find is what are the ways in which you can actually apply Gen AI and techniques like that to start differentiating this further. So this is where we really talking about what are the newer ways in which organizations are applying some of these platform engineering techniques to address the DevX issue. Going to the next slide, let's look at the first technique, right? So again, it must be fairly obvious. Title must be fairly obvious. You're talking about things like AI-driven automation. But what does that mean, really, right? So you have to think about what do you need to do, and then we'll talk about how are we going to do it. So as you look at what you need to do, again, going back to the MVP idea, you also always want to have some quick wins, right? You always want to have things that are going to provide you some immediate value. And that the ones that are providing immediate value may not have the highest ROI. So that might actually have challenges with, if you want higher ROI, you might have to put in a lot more effort. So what you would probably want to do is look at things like what's the quick win activities. So things like coding and implementation, whether it's the use of Copilot or any of these tools, it's fairly obvious. Same thing's happening within the testing space, right? Whether it is your unit integration testing or functional or end-to-end testing. These are all quick wins that you could really get. But if you want a higher ROI, you have to really start shifting left, right? You have to start going and looking at it from the point of view of understanding the requirements, and doing the user research and understanding, or changing your solution architecture, implying your solution architecture, changing the way you do your monitoring and observability. But these are all things that you want to do, right? But how do you do it? So the best way to do it is, again, I don't know how many of you are really starting to look at RAGs in your LLMs and all that, but really looking at it from the point of view of retrieval augmented generation to sort of augment your existing LLMs is probably the way to go. We are seeing that more and more of the organizations are starting to do that because RAGs are the ones that are actually going to bring that contextual information of what your organization is doing beyond what a model would actually provide. A large language model will have, even if you use something like a Cloud or a ChatGPT or whatever, right? It will all have some level of information, but at the same time, that it does not know enough about your organization. So you can sort of augment that using some of these RAGs. So using these RAGs to improve that developer experience is probably that first technique that you should be looking at. Let's look at the next one. So in this one, this is a very, very practical case. I'm sure a lot of you are sort of encountering today, right? So multi-cluster, anybody using Kubernetes is probably going through some challenges where you have things like, you have multiple clusters to manage, and how do you do it, right? So the way to actually do this is to use techniques like what you find in the Kubernetes operators and crossplane and all that. For those of you who are not too familiar with it, operators are typically custom controllers, right? That essentially automate your overall lifecycle management, but that happens for specific applications or services running inside your cluster. Whereas something like cross-plane is something that extends your Kubernetes to manage your external cloud infrastructure, right? So you'll probably need both of those things in this case. But if you apply that, the techniques around that, what you're really going to get is the unified control plane. You don't have to manage multiple control planes at that point. You can manage one. And you can also do some advanced cluster lifecycle management, and essentially you can optimize your whole thing. When I say optimize, it's not just from a process point of view, but it's also from a cost point of view. So your eventual developer experience gets better. The overall outcomes that you get out of this would also get far better. Next one. All right, so this is yet another problem I'm sure a lot of the developers have with respect to ephemeral environments, right? So when I talk to developers in various organizations, one of the first things I hear is like, "Hey, I wish I had this environment I could actually go and deploy whenever I want, however I want to do it, and make the kind of changes to the configuration of the environment as I need it." This is still a tough problem, right? This is a problem from the beginning of time whenever people started doing CI/CD, but it's still a huge problem within the industry. So one of the things that we should really think about is like, how could we actually provide the short-lived environments that developers can spin up on demand and shut it down when they are actually done using, so that you don't really end up wasting your resources doing it. So using GitOps and some custom templates and actually integrating that with pipelines. Again, using the Kubernetes technology, and of course, you need to have certain RBAC and auto scaling observability built into it too. You can really create production like an ephemeral environment. So we have done that, with various clients, and that has been extremely successful. There are a lot of tools out there too that's actually providing some of these things in a more packaged manner. But ultimately, think of it this way, right? If you want to improve that developer's experience, it is not just good enough that you let them code well and build their software well and test it. That testing absolutely requires an environment that they have access to whenever they need access to, as opposed to whenever it's the schedule allows them to go do that. All right, let's look at the next one. So this one is a little bit more of an advanced technique, but we are starting to see some real benefits of this technique. So using causal AI techniques, what we are really trying to do is to move that platform engineering work into the product space. So think of it like you are providing these platform capabilities to your developers to do various activities that they're doing, but in the end of the day, the production code actually goes to production, and then they have some bugs found by the customers. Any software is going to have some bugs, so it's going to come back. So who's going to address that? I'm sure your organizations have some kind of an operations folks or some kind of an SREs who are doing it. But what if the domain knowledge is not there with the operators or the SREs? In most cases, that domain knowledge of what your functional code is not with them, right? Those SRE folks would be very, very familiar with the infrastructure management side of things. If there is an infrastructure problem, they can easily take care of it. They don't need developers' time. But here are cases in which you would probably need, some SREs to actually do the work, instead of the developers, right? So to do that, one of the techniques that we are seeing a lot more applied is like, how about if you start first of all, instrumenting an application with observability? That's a given. That's again table stakes. Once you do that, you can see that your observability platform starting to proactively detect some of these patterns, or patterns. When I say patterns of issues that the customer should be seeing. A lot of it could be self-healed, right? And because, as I said, things like your infrastructure challenges and all those things can be addressed using self-healing. Once you do that, the idea becomes like now there's this next set of problems that are very domain specific. How do you actually train a new person? This new person could be your SRE, right? I mean, so you don't want to waste your developers' time doing it. It could be your SRE doing it. It could also be some new developers, right? Some junior developers doing some of these things. How do you do that? So we use techniques like source graph Cody to actually to map out the domain, and really using the causal AI techniques to make sure that learning process of the domain is far more easier for these users, the newer users, junior developers, or SREs to be able to do that. Once you actually start doing the domain activities, and you can use some of these techniques to rewrite the code and fix the code, right? Because based on the issues that we have identified in the domain, these people has had a little bit more of understanding of the domain, they are able to generate the code. And then they can take it to the same testing cycle. And the last step is important, right? So you do all of these things. Now you fixed a production problem, a domain-specific production problem without the developer's inputs. And then you want to really let the send the PR to the developers. They can
Okay.
actually review.
Mr. Ajay, okay, sorry, someone give me a note about the time. Okay, go ahead,
Yeah,
complete.
just a couple of minutes. We should be. Yeah. All right. All right. So as you can see, this is a technique that will really help a lot with respect to saving those developers' time. Let's go to the last one. Next slide. So this is an interesting one in the sense that if you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is something that we are seeing a lot more. If you really look at, again, Gartner's analyst reports and all that, you can see that sustainability is sort of coming back. Sustainability in this context means that are we actually controlling your carbon emissions? Trying to make sure that you are not really doing irresponsible development. So there are lots of techniques that are happening within the space, but the one I would recommend looking at is that applying some of these tools to ensure that you can understand, first of all, ahead of time, what are the architectural changes that you need to do to ensure that you use the resources out of cloud, what that is less, or more carbon friendly, but at the same time, continue to track that and continue to improve that using some of the costly AI techniques. So to conclude, let's go to the next slide and talk about a couple of case studies, right? So in the next slide, I mean, again, I know it's a busy text. Hopefully, you can have access to the slide and you can take a look at it. But this was a case in which we were working with this large bank in the US who are really focused on some of the infrastructure improvements and all that. And they had all kinds of platform SRE work working well, all the infrastructure things working well. But their challenge was that their developers still couldn't actually be very productive because about 60%, 60 to 70% of their time was actually spent doing some of those fixes that somebody else could do. So what we did in this case is that, remember that technique 4 that we talked about, using the source graph code to do the domain analysis and doing a rewrite of the code and have that merged by the developers. We applied that technique and we were able to actually significantly reduce the challenges the developers had. The actual the DX happiness index, essentially how happy the developers were with respect to how productive they could be, was by 8x. And the turnaround time of fixing these issues, your MTTR, improved by about 400%. And the last case study, the next slide, this was more of a case of a sustainability problem, right? In a CPG organization, in a consumer packaged good organization, had the ESG regulation, and they were required to reduce the carbon footprint, but they were struggling to do that, right? Because this required some additional work on their end. So what they ended up doing was, again, apply that technique 5 to actually try and reduce the carbon footprint by making some of the architectural changes, as well as making sure that you continuously monitor and improve that. All right, so to conclude, the next slide.
Next slide.
Essentially, what we need to think about here is that developer productivity is an easy thing to complain, but it's very hard to fix because it includes people process technology. But again, apply that platform engineering techniques, and especially those more advanced techniques, and that's what's really going to keep you in the game for the next 5 years. And if you're not doing, don't worry about it, because as you can see on the right side, there are a lot of people who just started doing it, right? I mean, again, more than 50% of people started doing it in the 5 years. So you're not too late to that party if you haven't done it yet. Right? So again, if you go to the last slide. So if you want to learn more about it, just reach out to me. Again, if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, feel free to scan that. I look forward to hearing some feedback from you all.
Thank you, Mr. Ajay, for your time. Thank you very much.